My name is Jim Drowan. I'm Vice President of Lifespan Technologies. I'm already having a technical glitch here, folks, so bear with me a second. There we go. My name is James Drowan. I'm Vice President North American Sales for Lifespan Technologies. Lifespan International is a division of CDI that provides ITAD services, IT asset disposition. And for this call, I will be the proverbial subject matter expert. CDI, for those of you who are not aware of, is a legacy subsidiary of a leasing operation, and that is my background as well, working with other leasing organizations and then ultimately with CDI. And I bring that up in that that's the legacy of CDI's DNA, as it were, in the IT asset disposition business. For close to 30 years, CDI has been involved in the value chain as it relates to end-of-life IT assets. And what you'll see today is kind of the continuing evolution of where we've ended up in what is now pure ITAD business. On the call with me in support roles today are Michael McKean, who is sales manager for the supply side of our business. And some of you on the call probably know Mike and his team, who are those folks that are directly providing you with supply asset quotations. And that is an underlying theme in our bringing ITAD to you today. Is within our organization, we've made some material changes in how we approach this business that are, I think, meaningful to those of you in the education business looking to get support in terms of IT asset disposition and work with CDI, who is also your supplier. Or as the case may be, not necessarily. And I'm going to touch on a couple of examples where we have provided ITAD services not relating to product that we may have initially provided. Christina Foster is a manager of our client services, and client services is the group that manage our logistics and support for the actual ITAD contracts, basically the service delivery. I think that Christina will be helpful should anyone have any particular questions as it relates to how we actually move the product around. In terms of the agenda, I am going to be so bold to present what I think is a best practice objective for disposal strategy as it relates to your surplus IT assets. I want to share with you a little bit about what we call the 3 pillars of ITAD and the various elements that we address and why they're important and what you need to be thinking about as it relates to these pillars and the ultimate ITAD policies you put in place in your organizations. I do have a couple of examples of work we've done in the EDU space, where the majority of my day-to-day activity is in working with enterprises, typically corporations, public and private sector of 1,000 seats or greater. We have been providing ITAD services to our education clients since we entered into the sale to ITAD, certainly the sale of refurbished product to education. But it's been over more so the last 5 years, and I think with the launch of some upcoming offerings and the evolution of our own ITAD business, that we really do scale better to the education vertical than we had in the past. And I'm pretty excited about that. So moving right along. The triple bottom line objective. You know what, I've just been flagged to pause just for a second because I did miss one bit of housekeeping. I do have a Q&A session at the end, and I would like you to hold off sort of general questions till then. However, if there is any issues that you're having with the receipt of this message or any of the visuals, if you can use the tool to raise your hand, I will see that, and then we can stop and address that. All right. So back to the webinar. So the triple bottom line objective. So it's in our experience and a suggested best practice that you should consider all 3 of the elements that I have on the slide here. So data security, economic recovery, and environmental stewardship are what we call our 3 pillars. And what I find is that frequently these elements of ITAD are isolated, and they're dealt with in individual fashion, and each of them have their own complexity, and they are interrelated. And then focusing on any one of these elements, you have the potential to lose sight of the overall impact. So in understanding each and considering all, you're going to avoid having an overlying impact that is negative. So if I look at those three on our screen going left to right, data security, that often falls into a compliance role. Someone in compliance has set some rules down to that, but maybe haven't considered if they've, what happens to the materials that have been, in the case of, say, for example, hard drives that have been physically destroyed. What happens to those materials? Well, there's quite possibly an environmental exposure there. Also, maybe they've just said, you know what, from a compliance standpoint, I just want you to shred those. That's the policy, shred. With further consideration and review of your risk, there's a considerable possibility that there's been value lost without necessarily needing to do so. So my point being that there's many options that would allow you to exceed or at least meet your compliance requirement on risk without, say, for example, physically destroying the drive. In the, again, moving left to right, in the center, value recovery, far too often this is something that is seen as a transaction. We often are engaging with procurement departments and other organizations, and all they're looking at is just that, show me the money. And we understand and get that. We all, as consumers of goods and good custodians for the organizations we work for, looking to get value for those assets that we are retiring. At the same time, a single focus on the asset recovery and getting the most money is fraught with risk. Who is the buyer? Well, what if those things that they buy don't work? What do they do with them? What are they doing in terms of data security? What if our own internal data security did not hit the mark and we've sold to someone who internally markets into a dangerous zone for some reason? Again, there is risk associated with focusing just on the value recovery. Environmental stewardship, very broadly, there is there's a lot of risk and not enough guidance. If we look across the board, and we're talking to a North American audience here, I'm not going to divide it in Canada and the US because they're substantially different. There's no laws per se in terms of what you need to do with your surplus IT assets but there is confusion as, there is laws per se, but those laws vary state to state. I have a slide at the end with some materials and links, one of which will give you the specific rules and regulations, laws per state, but each of those is quite varied. There is some producer responsibility, the manufacturer being the producer, having some responsibility to cover some of the costs, but it's very confusing for you to most often opt into those programs, and generally they are being addressed to a consumer and or municipal base. And the challenge there is trying to assess through that. And the risk associated with that is imminent to you as an organization for basically not doing the right thing. So the point here is you're trying to get all three of these things covered. And but what's the problem? I'm going to talk a little bit more about e-waste as a challenge, and just very quickly you can read through these. But the main issue here is it's not a good thing to not dispose of these things correctly. It is challenging to determine who is doing it correctly. Again, back to the laws, there is very limited legal issues with moving devices into landfill, for example, yet there is tremendous issues with doing so in terms of the toxic materials within these devices. And on top of that, from the economics of the waste cycle. So when we're talking about waste here, we're talking about processors, basically those people that are going to harvest the valuable materials within our electronics, which would be gold, silver, aluminum, and those other materials. There is still a remaining large economic driver that would move those materials offshore. It's more cost effective to do that in geographies where there are not labor laws that require proper ventilation and equipment and training and what have you. And beyond that just being not good, there is some inherent risk, and then that gets trailed back to you. When we talk to our corporate customers, we talk about protecting their brand, and I would suggest you in EDU, you also have brands. And a asset that that is found in, again, one of these geographies being processed inappropriately, there is a risk that is traced back to the most recent user, and that exposes you to a brand damage, as it were. So environmental stewardship is the solution. So if the risk is, or the problem is e-waste, the environmental stewardship is the solution. And the way that that has to be addressed is full audit and awareness. I mentioned previously that the cost associated with not doing the right thing could be very expensive. Free disposal could be very expensive if the assets you retire don't go to the right place and they're tracked back to you, and potentially the harvesting of hard files that were not properly erased at your site end up again in a location that's been quite well documented, that goes on continually in today, where parties are purchasing materials from ostensibly e-waste scrap organizations who are not certified to one of the two standards that I have at the bottom here, R2 or E-Stewards, buying those materials in bulk solely for the harvesting of hard drives, using relatively sophisticated but not expensive tools, using labor, and again, pick your developing country, we'll slam wherever it could be, in Africa, China, what have you, and seeking data off of these drives. Well documented, huge risk, and a risk very easily avoided by working with a certified organization. Similar point, donation stream is risky because, again, the data security is one element of that, but also what happens to the materials that they no longer need. What are they doing? Do they have the resources to ensure that it goes to appropriate downstream? Again, I won't go on. Again, the state programs vary, non-inclusive of all e-waste material. I do have some supporting material for you to research if you wish on your own state or location. My comment on the overlapping standards here is really on the environment. R2 and E-Stewards are somewhat competing standards, but they basically are both acceptable in my opinion, and gold standards. We've been, as an organization, participants and certified to both standards over time. We were under the Lifespan brand very much instrumental in the creation of the E-Steward standard. We have been on the board of R2 at points. We are currently R2. The ISO 14001 as an environmental standard, but it does not audit you to the appropriate downstream. So I guess in the diligence that you would have in looking at parties that you're going to dispose of your surplus IT assets, especially if you're considering them waste, is if they're not R2 or E-Stewards, all of the risk points above are exacerbated. NAID is a standard I wanted to mention that relates to National Association Information Destruction, a certification that we have, their AAA standard, and it's a tremendous standard. It's the gold standard of data security, but we have competitors in our market space that are promoting just that standard, yet they're not R2 or E-Stewards. And again, it's our opinion and belief of best practice that you really need to have someone who is either R2 or E-Stewards to ensure that your downstream is going to the right spot. Data security. So what we're focused on is media that's off the network. The hard files are the largest component of that, and most obvious, the hard files in notebooks and desktops, and servers and storage, but also in your networking equipment, in your printers and phone systems, and so on. And it's all about care, custody, and control when it's in your possession, where it's going, and so on. In terms of adversarial risk, I think that's possible in EDU. We do certainly see in some of the enterprises that we deal with, that they feel, if I look at some of the banks we deal with, that they are very much subject to adversarial risk. People definitely targeting the defined data. And that's possible, I'm sure, in EDU, but more often it's incidental or malicious. In our experience, that's the feedback that we've had in folks in EDU, that they're concerned about that, one, just losing it, and two, that someone is maliciously trying to get it for purposes of discrediting the organization. And we look at economic recovery, which we're going to touch on in another slide. It is a balance of risk versus reward. And my point really here is that many of the transactional, those people in that middle button earlier on, are focusing on just the dollars, are not assessing the company that they're selling the products to against a comparative on the data security. So I guess the real point here is that if you are looking at a transaction to sell, what are you doing to ensure the data is secure? Internal versus external resources. So this is a big differentiator for ourselves, and in our experience, what we find is that IT organizations across the board are challenged economically to conduct a lot of the proper data security aspects. And so as much as someone may be offering more dollars, they're not necessarily able to provide the level of security or the guarantee of the downstream risk. And so we got to look at a total cost comparison. It's kind of that age-old expression: you can have good, fast, or cheap, but you can only pick one. And then finally, in terms of privacy compliance, these are just a few of the challenges in terms of the regulations that you are legally obligated to consider. I was just recently at the NAID, National Association of Information Destruction annual meetings, and this point came up in one of the presentations, and there was a much longer list of the various regulations that all expect you to consider and to be compliant to, in addition to these few that I've put up that you're probably more familiar with. And what's interesting is that in all cases, none of these are actually giving you a how-to. It's basically take reasonable care. And what's your definition of that? What is your definition of reasonable care? Sorry, I'm jumping slides here. Finally, economic recovery. So what we are talking about here is how do you maximize this? So you can read the bullets. What I would talk to is then the first thing I would always suggest to those that are looking to manage their assets is to continue to maintain a good data set through the useful life of the assets, but at the time of disposition, be able to provide us with a, or whoever you're working with, a good configuration with quantity and also availability. It's all about planning in advance. That's my other point: balance useful life with cost of retention. Without a doubt, it's kind of the metaphor of the car. How much is it costing me to continue to drive this? It's still working, but it's costing me more. It's the same kind of thing, understanding when you're going to dispose. And we are very much working, the most success we have with all of our clients in ITAD is when we start working with them in advance. So mapping out a plan. I have these today. I think I can use them for this long, and we can do a little bit of pro forma forecasting of what value will be in the future. In terms of locking down a value, we really don't go much further than 30 days out, but we can have an intelligent discussion about what we should be considering. And don't stockpile IT assets. This is we're more in the rotting fruit business than the fine wines. These things don't get better with age. And I know that storing assets has some risk. It takes up space. I have experienced that in EDU, that there is a tendency to bulk these things up for a number of reasons, resources being one. However, we have found that as much as logistics is a element of cost in the ITAD world, transporting 2 or 4 skids makes sense. So versus holding on and waiting till we have a trailer load of goods, starting to move the goods earlier is important. And the last point is, there's processors and versus refurbishers. Product we get is that last look as what could we do? Can we get a part? Can we get a whole unit? Can we get something out of it? Versus those in the processing business that are looking just to grind it to those metals. This is a very busy slide. I won't go into it in detail. I just wanted to touch on the far left, or the middle note, any device in that far left. Most often people are in the EDU space when looking to us for ITAD are just thinking of their PCs and notebooks and now Chromebooks. However, we do lots of Cisco networking equipment, basically anything with a plug. We don't do toasters and microwaves. We often get them sent to us. In the middle is just a comprehensive piece of all the various elements of what our services can entail. Again, back to my point, it's just not a sale transaction. There's lots of elements we do. And the final piece is our downstream. We talk in our ITAD business about upstream and downstream. You, as an EDU customer that would be potentially providing us with assets that you're disposing of, are what we call upstream. And then the downstream is what we do with that product. And that final image to the right on this slide is all the various channels that we have. Majority of the product we deal with ourselves, but we basically manage that downstream. And if you were to look at sort of managing this yourself internally, you would not have access to the number of relationships and resources we have. We do over $1 million a month in upstream ITAD business. The downstream is exponential to that, and so essentially we have the volume to ensure that we're maximizing that value. Just real briefly, a couple of these case studies, because I'm getting close to time and I want to have some Q&A. Real quickly, just to give you a flavor. So a couple of years back in Ontario, Canada, we did a tablet upgrade for 17,000 devices. And what's really important about this, from my opinion, was, one, the scale. And what we actually did here was manage a lease return. So these assets were not owned by us. We hadn't even provided them. They were a manufacturer. The manufacturer leased the assets, and there was a timeline. Any of those of you that are doing leasing, and depending on the structure and kind of lease, you will often have a timeline to return the assets, or there's going to be some costs. And there's also potentially some costs subject to the condition of this asset that you're returning. We had a 3-month window to pull these devices. We went school to school. We pulled all of the tablets from carts, and then we actually installed the new tablets in those carts. Again, we did not supply those. They were manufacturers, and brought the assets back to our facility. We did test and audit on those assets. The assets that failed our test and audit, the school had an option to purchase, and they either purchased some for reuse internally, or CDI purchased those, and therefore they were not subject to any penalties in returning them to the lessor. It was the classic win-win-win. The next scenario happened in Pennsylvania, 1,000 desktop refresh. This one was a couple of years back. There was 4 campuses, and the scenario here was basically a staffing issue, and you all have different challenges in that regard. This one in particular, there had been a strike with the custodial staff who had previously been able to sort the materials in the various schools and then skid them. That was no longer the case. We went on site and provided the logistics, provided the labor to go class to class, move the assets to central locations. There was no loading docks at most of the facilities, but they had one that did. We moved them as in smaller truck to a larger facility, skidded and removed the devices. And then last, the 500 notebooks, 11 boxes. This is an illustration of just being creative, and again, kind of working towards that win-win. The value in notebooks is more when they're working, and I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of that. Therefore, packing is an ongoing issue. And we, over time, on the supply side, as many of you will be aware, have developed very unique and special boxes and sleeves, and basically provided, in this case, 11 skids to the site where the client themselves, with their own labor, were able to box up, and then we're picking those up. We're getting a better valued equipment back, and the boxes were delivered earlier, therefore they could gather these units over time. So at a glance, and again, a busy slide that I won't go over in all details, but I mentioned earlier how we've tried to scale the lifespan ITAD offering to the EDU client, and one of the biggest steps we've done there is having the dedicated account rep. The same person that's selling you assets are the ones that you can engage with to support your ITAD. They in turn will work with the CPR group, Christina Foster, who's on the call here today, her team, to work on logistics and scheduling. Equipment then rolls back to our facility for processing. There's reporting, and then shortly after there's a settlement report. We have a very robust set of reports that you get, depending on other stakeholders in your organization. We most often hear from those people that have accountability for these assets that the information and reporting we provide helps them support what has been going on. These assets at some point are on your balance sheet. At a minimum, someone's going to say what happened to them. Other disposal methods are frequently not giving the kind of data that auditors are looking for. We are able to provide great detail, even on those assets that don't have a second life. We're going to be able to minimum capture serial number, manufacturer, and what it was. And samples of those reports are available through, again, your EDU rep can share those with you as we are talking to you, if we are talking to you about disposition. So we've brought this, down to a simple three-step process. We have created a IT asset removal questionnaire. There's a link to that. I'll just go briefly to that. Hopefully it's functioning and not going to take a lot of time. Are they going to be able to see that? I'm going to, if I just do this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this, bear with me a moment. You know what, and for sake of time, I'm going to pass on showing you the form. We'll send that link out to participants, and you will be able to have a look at that. It's a simple form that we're looking for to gather that critical information that will allow us to provide you with an estimate of value, which is asset value plus any costs associated in the services you're looking for. Once you've completed that, the client services rep working with the EDU rep will provide you with a contract, a statement of work, and then it's simple as confirming the date and scheduling a pickup. 3 steps, very easy. Wrapping up, I'm 4 minutes over here now. I'm going to slide by this, but we will share this information, and there's some of the information that I think might be of use for you as you're working on your ITAD policy. I will also ensure, and again, my apologies for not having the most sophisticated use of this tool. I wanted to take you to the Lifespan website, and we have on that website some white papers, 2 of which are very much about how to build to assist you in building a policy, and it's really a la carte, and so just some things to consider and how you might want to build internally a disposal policy that hits those 3 bottom line objectives we started with. And I'm open for questions, which I believe you can bring on the tool. So yeah, there's a Q&A tool if you have on the bottom of your screen, if there's any questions or anything you'd like me to go back to or even attempt to try to get on the screen for you today. we'll just take another moment or two as maybe people are pondering. I have somebody typing a question. Yeah, take your time. We've got a few people looking to ask some questions, so we are good to stay for a moment or two. I've had a few of you ask for our sales rep to contact you, and we'll make sure that happens. Great. Okay, so I've got some questions here. Okay. I think I'm answering the question live here. I had a question, are there assets that are too old to be recycled or repurposed? To be repurposed, yes. Without a doubt, some of the materials that we receive from our clients have no second life. That's the downstream recycling portion. Just to get granular for a second, in some of the transactions we will do, based on the equipment list, we will move that product to one of our facilities. We will, at that facility, conduct triage. So we try to move things to closest proximity to the site we're picking up, reducing greenhouse gases from transportation. At those sites, we will, as I said, triage, and those assets that we feel have no second life will remain in that geography and be processed downstream. Okay, I hope that answers your question. I have another question, which is how does pricing work? The pricing is basically this. There are some cost elements to what we do, and those cost elements are going to be determined by how much we do versus what you do. The recovery is the value of those assets that we get back that have a second life, and that is netted out against. So if you look at a most common transaction, you're going to have, and we'll just use small dollars here, we're going to have $100 of cost, 50 of shipping and 50 of a certified data erasure, and then the equipment itself was worth $100 after we've received it, so there's no cost. If the equipment was worth 150, then there'd be 50 returned back. There is instances where the services and transportation would exceed the value of the equipment, and that is the cost to do things properly. So that was the pricing question. Okay, and I had another question about the links again. Please, how do we get them? I'm going to rely on the smarter people in terms of this application. We will have, I'm quite certain, a list of those people that registered and attended, and we will send out those links both to the sites that I mentioned that will give you some background, links to the CDI Lifespan website. And you will have those access. Could you bear with me just a second? I'm also going to paste those links into the chat in a moment or two and send that out so everybody still on will have that. So sorry, I've got a couple other questions here. Okay, so I have a question here. If we partner with you to dispose of or sell our old equipment, are there guarantees in regard to data security and transfer of liability? There are, absolutely. So we are, in addition to our NAID AAA certificate, which is telling you about how our practices, and basically, in addition to that, we carry $2 million errors and omissions insurance. And so if you elect to have us do that work, which is going to have a minimal cost on the disposition, you are transferring that liability to us. And we can go into more details with that on a one-on-call through your sales rep. Yeah, so I've got that message text as well, so I've got that answered for Mr. Bauer. And so the another question that I have here is the first step to reach out to a rep and get a review and quote to meet our needs. Absolutely, and will we put you in touch with a rep? Absolutely. So that is the first step, and the rep will have that form that I mentioned, which we're also going to send on a link, and you will be able to give them that information. So we're going to try and copy those links to the chat and share that with everybody. And that's the link to our, the first one link that you've got is the link to the asset removal questionnaire. And I think I had another person looking for these links, which I'm going to also copy to everyone. I think I did send all those, yeah. Again, I apologize if I did not get those links to you, but we will through the others. I think that if there's no further questions, I'm going to just double check here on the questions that I've received. Done. Bear with me. And yeah, again, the data liability question, we take over the liability when you elect to have us conduct the data erasure, either through physical or wiping. And that's all I have in terms of questions. So we are 15 minutes over original time. I apologize for that, but I hope you got some value in what we did today. And we will be communicating to all attendees and to the associated account managers that are responsible for you as a partner. And we look forward to supporting you in your IT asset disposition needs moving forward. Thank you.